Hello, everybody. It's good to be sharing in worship with you again today. Whether we are joining together in a service in a church, whether you're worshipping at home, and even if you're watching this sometime in the future. The 28th of July is an important day for me because this is my final day of preaching in the Ipswich Methodist Circuit, and during this morning I will be leading my final service at Museum Street Methodist Church, and then this evening there will be my farewell service. It isn't actually the end, because I will be sharing in this format at the end of August, so I will see some of you again at that point. But it's significant because this marks change, and that means that for Karen and I, we will be moving to the Central Norfolk Circuit, and we'll be living in Dereham and serving different churches, different people. And for the people here in Ipswich, there will be a new superintendent and a new minister to replace me. And so it's that period of everything changing. And it's interesting because it all seems to be happening at the same time as the nation is preparing for the way ahead with a new government, with a new administration, new ways of doing things, a whole load of new people in Parliament who have never been there before, and everything feels to be different. And I'm reminded that we don't always find change easy. Looking back at the 1980s, the E word, evangelism, was something that I don't ever remember really cropping up. When I was a little lad growing up in the 60s, you were either church, which meant you went to the parish church, or you were chapel, which meant you went to the Methodist chapel, because they were the two options in the village. And there were those four that went to neither. But the majority of people seemed to go to one or the other. And you sort of assumed that if they weren't with us, then they were with the others. And that was the way life went. When Cameron and I married, we started to attend a fairly successful city Methodist church in Bradford, the biggest church in what was then the Woodhouse Grove Methodist Circuit, and we had a huge membership. And I can remember those glory days when we used to have to get extra chairs in for special services like parade services once a month, and we were getting congregations of 200 plus, and were quite content. We didn't need to evangelise. Why would we? New people kept coming in. We were a successful church, and people kept coming and joining us, and it was all wonderful. So we didn't do anything. Why bother? And then towards the end of the 80s, it became apparent that churches were getting smaller. Memberships were declining and things had to change. And we then went into the decade of evangelism. And if I'm being honest, at the end of the decade of evangelism, there was very little to show for the work that we had done during the decade. And if anything, the churches were smaller than they had been before. And we were frantically trying to think, how do we get people to come? And you see, as you look back at the Bible, and you look back at the time of Jesus, he'd got the knack. And the idea was, well, maybe we should look at Jesus. And Jesus seemed to speak in the language that people wanted to hear. And I can remember being part of a group that said, what we need to do is make church more trendy, more dynamic, more exciting. Shove out the boring sermons. Let's make it a place that people want to come. And I can remember in my day sitting and listening to some really dreary sermons. And that's the key. More dynamic preachers. And I, so filled with the idea, offered to become a preacher. And that was going to be the answer. But people didn't flood in. I can remember seeing some of those clever wayside pulpits. Carpenter wants joiners. We have an exciting worship every Sunday at 10:30. Come and join us. And nobody came. And the difficulty is, we feel like we're failing. And that is hard. And we want to be like Jesus. We look at this amazing story from St. Mark's Gospel, where Jesus is there with a crowd of 5,000 people. Oh, what would we give to have a crowd of 5,000 listening to us? So dynamic was his preaching that he attracted huge numbers like that. And if we can just be like that, they will come. But they don't. And where do we go then? And I think over my lifetime, working in the church, working more recently as a minister, it has become a struggle. And then I look at this story. It's entitled, in the copy of the Bible I've got here, The Feeding of the 5,000. Not the amazing teaching of Jesus. Because you see, what Jesus does is he looks at this crowd of 5,000 people. He looks at them and he takes pity on them. Because he knows they've made a great journey to be here. They're tired, they're hungry. They need food. And before he starts feeding their minds and feeding their spirits and feeding their souls, he feeds their bodies. He sorts out the food that they need. And that is something that I think the church has taken far too long to learn. That until we start serving the community, they ain't going to come to worship, because it is so far outside their culture now that they don't fit anymore. And if they are ever going to fit, we are going to have to change. And the second part of the reading, it would have been a magnificent enough reading if all we'd concentrated on was the fact that Jesus takes this little lad's packed lunch and feeds 5,000 people with it. It would be a wonderful enough story, but then straight on after that, as evening comes, Jesus goes away as the disciples start to cross the water. And Jesus sees them in their hour of need. And once again, we get this image of the Jesus who is more bothered about their personal, their physical needs than their spiritual needs. He can deal with the spiritual, but first of all, he has to deal with the practical stuff. And Jesus walks on the water to get to them. It's miraculous enough that he walks on the water, and over the years, with both these parables, people have looked and said, yes, but how on earth has he done this? How did he feed 5,000 people? Well, once he'd taken the one little lad's packed lunch, people said, well, I've got some ham sandwiches with me, and over here I've got some sausage rolls. And they all started sharing them out, and there was nothing magical about it. There was nothing miraculous about it. It was just a load of folks shared what they got. And people are quite satisfied with that as an explanation. But it is more about Jesus meeting their needs. And as we look at this second story, it's entitled Jesus Walks on the Water. But what's actually happening is Jesus sees that the disciples are in their hour of need, and he comes to them, and he cares for them, and he deals with their problem. If the church is to be meaningful in the 21st century, we start by recognizing the needs of the people. And once we start to serve the needs of the people, we get an opportunity to share the gospel message. We have a new government. And the key, I believe, to them being successful in everything they do is to start to understand the needs of the people, and then to start to sort those issues out. Then and only then will they be successful in the work they do. And we need to learn ourselves from that. Amen.